Oh, there we've got Samson. Brilliant. Ready to go?
In a moment. We're just waiting on the live stream for YouTube.
Okay.
But the attendees are joining us right now.
And we have about 2,000, is that correct?
2,000 pre-registered. So we'll have a couple hundred within the Zoom and then more people watching online. And we are live on YouTube, so please go right ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you participants, some 2,000 registered from all corners of the globe. Our side event is about building effective joint approaches for monitoring and data gathering for the SDGs. And I want to give special thanks to the organisers and to UNITAR and to the governments of the UK, Kenya and Denmark for supporting such an important event. This event will focus on tools and approaches for empowering actors, improving coordination, and strengthening SDG data reporting for the second reporting cycle. My name, about me a little, is Sylvia Beals, and I represent the Grey Panthers and the Stakeholder Group on Aging within the Action for Sustainable Development Global Network. I'm very pleased to moderate the session at the outset of the Ministerial Week. Central to the vision and success of the SDG agenda and its promise to leave no one behind are 4 interconnected and indivisible priorities. In the first place, how we measure and set standards so that the human rights of all people across the life course and in all their diversity can be realized. In the second place, how can we have accurate knowledge, data, statistics about how people are faring, especially those most left behind? Thirdly, what are we doing to hear the people themselves and learn as to how much the goals and targets are effectively making a difference? And fourthly, what are the partnerships we need and can make to achieve the 2030 Agenda Vision? So this workshop will explore these issues through showcasing tools and experiences on SDG data gathering and practical application in the cities of Bristol, UK, and in Los Angeles. Secondly, we will look at the use of the human rights framework for accountability and policy making with specific experience of Kenya. And we will thirdly look at the methods that civil society are using with a practical example of a case study of India to ensure voice and participation in the reporting process. So a bit of information for those online. The workshop will be in 3 segments of 25 minutes each. I will introduce the speakers, opportunities for questions and answers after each segment. So please, everyone, be prepared to upload your questions in the Q&A facility. Speakers will try to respond to all questions because we know it won't be possible to do it within the time constraints, but afterwards. And finally, to say, all presentations will be made available with SDG Learning on the SDG Learning website with links and contacts to follow up. So to kick off, I wish to turn to our most distinguished opening speaker, Ambassador Martin Bille Herman, hope I've said that right, Permanent Mission of Denmark to the UN. Ambassador, I am really honored to request your remarks. You are an economist by profession with insight and expertise of development policy, head of Danida, with in-country experience of Indonesia, East Timor, and Papua New Guinea, and with prior experience with UNDP in Bhutan. We are fortunate to have your guiding remarks on the importance and benefits of linking human rights and SDG monitoring and reporting for achieving the visions of the 2030 Agenda and ensuring a whole of society approach in monitoring and reporting. Ambassador, the floor is yours. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I hope you can hear me, and that the same goes for what some 2,000 participants, which I gather have joined us across the world. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this important event, focus on how we can best build what you might call sort of effective joint approaches for monitoring and data gathering on the SDGs. And I think you cannot emphasize enough the importance of monitoring and data gathering. What's get measured gets done. Now we are entering the decade of action at the same time as we unfortunately see that the progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals has stagnated or is perhaps even set back. Now I think to achieve, as you said, Sylvia, to achieve the visions of the 2030 Agenda, but at the same time also the promise of leaving no one behind, we need not just action, we need accelerated action. And accelerated action at scale can only happen if you explore and release, if you like, the full potential of all of society. And so you need a human rights-based approach to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, in our view, embedded in Agenda 2030. And there is no doubt that when we take a human rights-based approach to development, the results become more powerful, they become more sustainable, and they become more effective. Now, the Danish Institute for Human Rights actually mapped this out and discovered that actually more than 90% of the 169 targets of the SDGs are directly linked to human rights instruments. Now, this is a powerful finding that I encourage all of you to explore. Need for strengthening synergies between Agenda 2030 and the Human Rights Agenda, not just in theory, but in practice. Now, human rights on paper needs to be turned into realities on the ground. And to do that, we need to integrate monitoring and reporting mechanism as an important starting point. And I think timely discussions on this in today's event with outset in concrete experiences and best practices from Kenya can play a crucial role in this. Now, in relation to this, it's also clear that accelerated action at scale, as I said initially, requires what you said we are called a whole of society approach to monitoring and reporting on the SDGs. And this means that inclusion must be a guiding star. Inclusion must be a central part of our compass. And not just pro forma inclusion, meaningful inclusion. Now, the integrated nature of the Sustainable Development Goals partnership with local communities that understand best how to address local sustainable development challenges. And effective coordination is absolutely key to avoid duplication of efforts and promote these synergies. But this must not only be across sectors of society, it must also be across generations. And let's not forget that Sustainable Development Goal 17 is all about partnership. It is all about the realization that we can only achieve Agenda 2030 if we work together. Now, these partnerships must be harnessed to foster innovation, integrated approaches, solidarity and inclusivity, and actions to leave no one behind. But it's critical to make sure that all voices are heard and represented, including minorities, indigenous people, LGBTI+, young people especially, because they are critical actors, not only because they are beneficiaries, because they are critical change agents. So when we implement the SDGs, we must give meaning because we are creating a future. And when we build back better in the face of COVID-19, we must remember that we are borrowing from the resources of future generations, and the least we can do is to invest it in their interests. And I think this discussion of how to include all groups of society in the implementation and monitoring and reporting on SDGs is, as I said, even more needed now in the context of COVID-19. Unfortunately, we witness illegitimate restrictions on the fundamental political, civil, and social rights carried out under the disguise of COVID-19 restrictions. And with these remarks, I have tried to stress why I think that the theme of today's event is both not very timely, but also extremely relevant for accelerating action and accelerating action scale towards the SDG during this next decade of action, and hopefully already from today. Thank you so much for listening.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your remarks. You were within time because my timer is going off, and you said a great deal of very important things. You talked about strengthening synergies and meaningful inclusion, and inclusion being a guiding star for our success. You talked about solidarity and inclusivity, and all voices should be heard because all people are change agents, some more than others. And you talked about borrowing from the resources of future generations as we recover from COVID. So these are really important thoughts, and thank you so much. I know you have to run off now, but we're grateful for your remarks, and if we could have them and perhaps use them to publish them in some report, we would be very happy for your permission. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Permission hereby granted.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on to. Sorry.
Christine Patel, one other.
Go away. I beg your pardon. The trouble with mobile phones, eh? I'm going to open the next segment now on the SDG data tools. Stop it. And I'm going to call on 4 experts. We have 4 experts for this session. The first one I'm going to introduce is Fiona Dorr, who heads up the Sustainable Development Goal team at the UK Office for National Statistics, and whose team are responsible for reporting and sourcing UK data to monitor progress for the goals. She will be followed by Dawn Comer and Angela Kim. Dawn has worked with the Mayor's Fund for Los Angeles to localize the SDGs to develop and implement an open data platform to track the city's progress towards the goals. And Angela Kim worked data sourcing and reporting for the Los Angeles city. And they will split their 5 minutes, and they will be followed by Alan McLeod, who works in partnership between the Bristol City Office of the UK and the University of Bristol to help the citywide implementation and monitoring of the goals. So we are very pleased to invite Fiona to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction, Sylvia. So as Sylvia said, we're going to cover the differences and synergies between national and local reporting. We're going to talk about the importance of partnerships to be able to access and source data for SDG reporting at both levels. We're going to talk about the tools and frameworks available for reporting and understanding SDG data. So I'm going to start off by talking about the national level, and then I'll pass to my colleagues from the City of Los Angeles and Bristol City Office to talk about about reporting at the local levels. The next slide, please. So as Sylvia explained, I'm the head of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UK Office for National Statistics. And our remit is to source and report data to be able to monitor the UK's progress towards the SDGs. We report the UK SDG data on our national reporting platform that has been constructed using OpenSDG. It's a reporting tool that we're developing in partnership with the US government and the Centre for Open Data Enterprise. So I'm going to use the UK SDG data to show you some of the features of the tool. And as you can see from this slide, this is the front page of our national reporting platform. OpenSDG, which is the tool, is freely available to anyone to use. And the UK is able to provide support for countries that are interested in adopting the reporting tool. Next slide, please. So this slide sort of shows where we are with the UK national reporting. We've focused on sourcing data to be able to provide at least headline data for the UK and are currently reporting data for 78% of the indicators. Our data sources are mainly official from official statistics, and the majority are statistical. For those that aren't statistical, we link to the relevant policies on our national reporting platform. To provide at least headline data for the remaining 22% of indicators, we need to broaden our net and use sources that are non-official. So we're starting to look at developing a protocol for using non-official data sources. This is non-government, academic, charity sector, etc., qualitative, citizen-generated data. We want to be able to use data that will be more informative, provide more of a context around the indicators, and not just for reporting the indicators as such. And it will help us with our disaggregation. Our platform already reports some non-official data sources, ranging from data collected by the University of Oxford to businesses such as Link, who provide all of the automated teller machines in the UK. We're working in partnership across government, academia, businesses, charities, etc., to be able to fill the data gaps and start looking at data from more of an inclusive point of view. We're doing really well at the national level in terms of headline data, as you can see. But a key leave no one behind disaggregation is the ability to report at the regional level. And this is where we're starting to work with local authorities such as Bristol to support them in their SDG reporting and to work out what that support should look like and to close the gap between national and local level reporting. Next slide, please. So this slide is just to show you a couple of the features on our national reporting platform. So on the left is that at the national headline level, that would be the dark line in the middle. And by being able to split it and show it by sex, you can see that there is a great differential between males and females in their likelihood to commit suicide. And the other kind of visualization is maps, and there's one there on the left, on the right, that shows the different regions in the UK and their quality of public services. So if we move on to the next slide. This is to show you where we are in the world in terms of what other countries are already using OpenSDG. Just a tiny bit of history. In 2017, the UK were looking for a platform to use for our SDG reporting. And we talked to the US government about their platform and decided that that was what we needed. It had the functionality. So we then worked with our data science colleagues at ONS and developed the platform further so that we could do more about disaggregation and looking and breaking down the data. We then started working closely with code with theirs over time to create OpenSDG. And the UK are now key developers of the OpenSDG platform. So together we're trying to build a community between all of the OpenSDG users so experiences can be shared and learned between us. The UK is able to provide different levels of support to a number of countries who use OpenSDG. So for example, we've led in-country workshops in Rwanda, Ghana and Kyrgyzstan. The next slide, please. Together with Los Angeles and Bristol, we're going to be holding a webinar on the 30th of July that's going to give us the opportunity to talk much more about the features of OpenSDG. And this slide highlights the main features of OpenSDG, but the key ones are that it's open source and it's free to use. So open source means that projects are allowed to use and reuse the data, the software, and they can also suggest areas of improvement. only uses software and services that is also free to use. I do hope that you'll be able to join us on the 30th of July at our webinar, where we'll be able to talk much more about Open SDG and more about some of the features that are mentioned on this slide. I'm now going to pass over to Los Angeles and Bristol, who are going to talk more about SDG reporting at the local level and how they have adapted Open SDG for local use.
Thanks, Fiona. So hello, everyone. It's great to talk to you today about our work and using SDGs at the local level and leveraging the Open SDG platform. So as Fiona mentioned, in Los Angeles, we also worked with Center for Open Data Enterprise to fork the code over for the local level. So during the 2019 HLPF, the City of LA launched its very first voluntary local review, as well as our local SDG data reporting platform built on Open SDG with support from Center for Open Data Enterprise. And while the VLR is a point-in-time narrative of our commitment to the goals, the reporting platform continues to be a living resource beyond the VLR to report our progress towards the goals. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you do see the image of our platform, and it looks very similar to what you'll see with the US and the UK and other countries who are also using Open SDG. Next slide, please. As the platform was forked from a national level use case, we did have to take some time to tailor some of the code to support our local government perspective. Specifically, one of the first things we noticed was that at the national level, the US and UK platforms show the goals and the indicators. As we had gone through a process of localizing target language, we updated the code to enable the targets to also show on the platform, in addition to the indicators. We then took a bottoms-up approach of identifying local data that aligned to the indicators. This led us to developing new indicators and thereby updating the code to also include tags that noted our localized updates. So as you'll see on this slide, with the indicators 10.x, those are new that we created at a local level. And also you'll see the flagging of new, just so that if someone's looking at the platform, they'll understand that these are specific to the City of Los Angeles. All reporting data was sourced from publicly available resources. It's important to note that at a local city level, there may be data that's not governed by city jurisdiction. For example, public from the county services versus city-run services. So to address progress on how we're serving Angelenos, data sources may be at the city, county, metropolitan statistical area, and or state level data. Next, my colleague Angela will share more information on progress made within the platform since our launch.
Thanks, Dawn. So as Dawn mentioned, we've done a lot of work in localizing the global framework and have added new indicators to reflect our local priorities. And most prominently, we've added indicators to measure LGBTQIA+ inclusivity under goals 5 and 10, as well as adding several leading indicators under goal 3. And the flexibility of the Open SDG platform has allowed us to customize the global framework, as well as develop new functionalities that are useful for us as a city, like adding trends lines and comparisons to national statistics. When Fiona mentioned for the UK, we're also relying on several different data sources for reporting, including localized official national statistics, city departmental data for our water, power, crime, and transportation data reporting, downscaled global satellite monitoring, community surveys, as well as citizen science data for our biodiversity monitoring. And with the diverse data sources and the new indicators that we've added, we're currently reporting on 151 indicators in the localized framework with the goal of reaching 100% reporting status by the end of this year. Next slide, please. And in this last slide for Los Angeles, I wanted to touch briefly on the importance of data disaggregation. So as with the global SDG framework, leaving no one behind is a key component of SDG localization efforts. And whenever possible, we disaggregate data by several demographic indicators as the global framework requires, but we're also identifying indicators that require further disaggregation by other characteristics like sexual orientation and gender identity. And as we disaggregate our data by those characteristics, we add them to the open SDG platform. And with the added benefit of being a local government is that we can use data disaggregation to guide targeted programs and services for the city. A couple of examples is that we're currently in the process of using the SDG indicators as a framework for measuring racial equity, as well as a lens through which we can analyze social service allocations within local government. So that's it for the City of Los Angeles, but as Fiona mentioned, please join our webinar on July 30th and add questions in the Q&A function. But now I'll pass it off to my colleague, Alan McLeod at the Bristol City office, who will talk more about the importance of partnerships for local reporting.
A little bit more on the partnership work. We have also been working quite closely with the ONS to think about some of our data work and how that can feed into supporting other cities. But as a city in Bristol in the southwest of the UK, we've got a population of about 500,000 people. And one of the key things that we've been looking at as a city is how we can partner better towards the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to be working not just as a city council, but also as a whole city towards the delivery of the SDGs. And as such, our VLR, our voluntary local review, was an attempt to try and understand not just the data for the city council, but also qualitative data and case studies of what was going on within the city. This required a strong partnership approach to collecting data and consolidating that into our VLR. And actually the whole approach to the SDGs in Bristol, partnerships, and has been focused on that from the origins of our localization of the SDGs in Bristol. As I said, we were the first UK city to undertake a VLR, and we produced that we produced a handbook as well to try and help other UK cities to understand where the data sits and how that can feed into their own localization of the SDGs. Our VLR had data covering every single SDG with approximately 150 indicators, and as many of these as possible were disaggregated by gender, ethnicity, geography, and age for similar reasons as have already been mentioned, to try and ensure that we were making full use of the data and understanding where people were being left behind and how we could better tackle that. This collaboration between the City Council and the University of Bristol was key in trying to understand and take on a comprehensive review of the SDGs and not just at the City Council level. You can go to the next slide, please. And to do that, we worked with the University of Bristol to try and understand what data was out there and what data we could use. We wanted to make sure our VLR was not just bench learning from each other and providing case studies and examples, but also provided an opportunity for benchmarking and trying to understand where the data sat in comparison to other cities. And so we had a priority framework for our data and for our indicators. Initially, we wanted to try and use as best as possible the exact SDG indicators so that where possible, they would be comparable across cities. Below that, we wanted to use urban sustainability indicators that other cities might be using. And so we provided an assessment overlap between 8 of these smartness and sustainability frameworks to understand what other cities were monitoring. At the next level down, we worked with our local council they were using to monitor some of the targets for the SDGs. And then below that, we worked with partners such as the Bristol Tree Forum and Bristol Water to try and fill some of those gaps that we had on data. You go to the next slide, please. All of this was underpinned by strong academic collaboration. My role is split between the University of Bristol and the Bristol City Office, trying to provide the full weight of the academic firepower of the University of Bristol to the City Council to ensure that the work on the SDGs was driven by a data-centred approach. This allowed us to ensure that we were using appropriate indicators, but also to work with experts at the university to fill the data gaps when we had issues. And we were able to draw on some of the key thinkers around issues around poverty and around food poverty in the city as a result of working with the University of Bristol. We were also able to use some of the networks and some of the partnerships that we have in Bristol. We've got a strong network which we use to disseminate information about our VLR, but also to draw information up. And that allowed us to collect qualitative data from community activism and action around local efforts to clean up parks and rivers, all the way up to corporate policies within the businesses and organizations in our city. These networks allowed us to draw widely from the city. Our VLR has also provided us with some of the key data sources for the SDGs at the local level in the UK. And we've been working with the ONS to think about how we can help share with other UK cities through platforms like OpenSDG to ensure that other UK cities are working on the SDGs and using the data that we've been able to find and the sources we've been able to find. I think we're now going to move into a time of Q&A. That's all I have to say on our approach, but Sylvia, are you taking the floor now?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very good. My alarm just went off. Well, thank you very much, guys. I mean, just to say, what you've given us is a very, really helpful sort of scene setter, that there are these very important tools explained by Fiona, that it is possible and indeed happening that goal reporting can be both localized and disaggregated, and that people are really interested at the local level to take things forward, as you explained, Alan, and the partnerships can be very rich, including academia and community. I mean, that's a sort of key takeout for me. I think we have some questions and a bit of time for Q&A. Can I start with a question from Luce Rooney to Fiona? The question is about why Central America and Latin America are not yet included in the map with the SDG platform. And I'll follow if you want to. I have another question about Latin America and Bristol, but if you to Latin America and Bristol, but if I mean Los Angeles and Bristol, but if you want to answer that, Fiona, that would be good to kick us off. Thank you.
Okay, yes, I can explain. So the map showed the countries that are currently developing a platform using the OpenSDG. So that the reason why there are no countries in Latin America and Central America is at the moment none of them have expressed any interest in anybody from those countries who might be interested in exploring the potential of using OpenSDG.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and do please follow up, as we said at the beginning. There's a lot to sort of take in, and there'll be loads of connections to be made. So the following question, I think it's from Erin Bromagim. Please can Los Angeles and Bristol, one of you from Los Angeles and you, Alan, speak about how they're sharing your experience and methodology on the voluntary local reviews. So over to you. Perhaps Angela or Dawn can kick off, and followed by Alan.
Sure. Oh, sorry, camera. I can get started. So for voluntary local, to our program website, where we have written a couple of articles on the process of the localization to write and publish our voluntary local review. But we also have written a lot of tutorials and how-to guides, not only on the methodology of the localization process of the framework, so bringing the global framework into the local level, but also created a technical wiki page to help other cities around the world that are looking to adapt Open SDG to the local level. So we're sharing the tools on how we went about doing that. And everything that we used is open source, as Fiona mentioned, and can be found online. We will go a little more in depth in the technical aspect and how other cities and countries can do this in our webinar. And it should be up, a link to our session should be on the slides, and you can follow that link and register.
Great, thank you very much. Alan, do you want to say anything about the Bristol experience?
We've produced a number of reports and documents that detail the experience of localization and how we went about looking at the SDGs in the local level. So that includes how we thought about the relevancy of targets, how we developed our framework, and our tool guide, our toolbook for producing a VLR. So that has specific utility in terms of UK cities interested in UK data, but it also has relevancy to other cities around the world or other organizations, subnational, in terms of how we engaged with stakeholders in our city about the Sustainable Development Goals, how we undertook a consultation process that was relatively cost-free and relatively easy to do. So both of those, I've posted the link in response to a different question for our VLR handbook. But a lot of the information that we used in terms of sharing and developing our VLR and our SDG approach at the local level is online, either on the Cabot Institute SDG webpage or on the link here on the bristol1city.com/SDG webpage as well.
Great, thank you very much. I've got a couple more questions that perhaps go together. One is about how a local government can use the Open SDG platform. Are there technical assistance processes for them to use it? And just to say that in Latin America, in Los Angeles, sorry, you have supported a wiki, haven't you, to help people adopt the platform. So perhaps you could make a comment on that. Thank you.
Sure, I can take this question. So we'll share, I think Erin, my colleague Erin, has already shared a link to the wiki in the Q&A function. So that's where it's outlined all of the code that we have developed. But in the beginning, as Dawn mentioned, we had a lot of support from the nonprofit Center for Open Data Enterprise as we were adopting it. And what's become is that there's this community on GitHub that works together through the functionality issues and setting up new functionalities as well. So if local governments are interested in setting up their own platforms, or I think I also saw another question of other sectors wanting to use the platform for their own reporting, there are tools and resources out there, and we're happy to connect you with the people that helped us set up our platform.
Muted. Unmute. Thank you very much, Angela. If there's any other comment, if not from any panelists, I have a question about. There's some questions about for UNITAR on the series and the availability of the video. Can I ask our colleagues from UNITAR to respond quickly on that?
Absolutely. All the videos will be available on the SDG Learning website and the UNITAR website. So if you go to unitar.org/NY, there'll be clear links to all the recordings, and we'll send that out as well. I'm sorry, Sylvia, you're muted.
All right, I'm unmuting. Am I unmuted?
You are, yes.
You said this would happen. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'm going to move on to this segment. Is a very, you know, it's a very, well, I would say dear to my heart, because it's about using the human rights agenda to the human rights framework for accountability. And as we know, the framework, the work being done by the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights with colleagues in Denmark and so on, have been developing some really interesting tools for this. So our first speaker, who we're going to have, is Marie-Eve Boyer-Friedrich, who's been working for the UN Human Rights Office for more than 10 years. Marie-Eve is a capacity building officer, and she reaches out to a variety of stakeholders to help them engage. Very important, because sometimes they can seem opaque. Marie-Eve will speak on behalf of the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, the Global Alliance, and the Danish Institute of Human Rights, and she will look at how human rights can contribute to improved quality of data and reporting on SDGs and SDG 16 and what tools are available. She will then be followed by our colleagues from Kenya. But please go ahead, Marie-Eve. You've got 8 minutes to take us through the tools.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. I will make a presentation, as Sylvia mentioned, on behalf of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which I represent directly, but also the Global Alliance for Reporting Progress on Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies, also known as Global Alliance for SDG 16+, and the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And my presentation will address 3 key aspects. One that has already been touched upon by Ambassador from Denmark before, so I will try to be brief on that one, is the centrality of human rights in the 2030 agenda. The second aspect is really the importance and the urgency of progress on SDG 16, including through the voluntary national review. And I will present some tools that can help in tracking the implementation of all the SDGs, of course, also in particular on SDG 16. First of all, the human rights, the 2030 agenda is a human rights-based agenda because it is people-centered, it is universal, it applies to all states, it connects civil, political rights, mainly in SDG 16, but also in SDG 5 on equality.
No, it's on my phone, but it won't let me.
Between men and women, it, of course, also addresses a number of economic and social rights, such as, for example, the right to food or the right to adequate housing, to name just a few. What's really important here is also the momentum behind the 2030 agenda and the renewed impetus to focus on acceleration of progress in the light of the COVID-19 crisis. And here, it is really important that the human rights framework and the 2030 agenda framework are not applied in parallel, that they really meet each other in a way and are interlinked, because they talk about the same thing, and you cannot implement sustainably the 2030 agenda without ensuring that no one is left behind, which is something very dear to human rights and that human rights enable. In terms of alignment, there are many things that I could say, but for purposes of time, I will just mention one thing that is important here is also how we can use as treaty bodies, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, or the Human Rights Council with the Universal Periodic Review, or recommendations from UN Special Rapporteurs, for example, how much those can help track the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And that's why it's really important to keep this in mind. And as the ambassador from Denmark mentioned, there is a very big link between the 169 SDG targets and human rights. And actually, a study by the Danish Institute for Human Rights has shown that more than 90% of the SDG targets are aligned with human rights. And the Danish Institute has developed a tool, which is the Human Rights Guide to the SDGs, which really makes this connection and shows for each of those 169 targets how they are connected to the human rights instruments. An important aspect, goal 16 on peace, justice, and inclusion, is the interconnection between this goal and the other goals, because SDG 16 is also an enabler and should not be seen as a separate development goal. We've seen anyway that all the 17 SDGs are linked to each other, but it's also important in the voluntary national review that states really include SDG 16 in the narrative, as a narrative throughout their VNR, and not only in a separate chapter, for example, on SDG 16. And here, the Global Alliance has developed a guide to report on SDG 16 in voluntary national reviews. And here I would like to mention that this guide underscores, as I said, the need to ensure that SDG 16 is integrated throughout the VNR, and the guide also shows how to draft the structure of the VNR and how and reported on. And it is drawn, this guide, on a member states' experience and on international recommendations. And it's available in the presentation. There's a hyperlink, so afterwards you will be able to go and look at the guidance in particular. Another tool that I would have liked to mention is a tool that it has been developed by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It's an online tool called the Universal Human Rights Index. This is really the repository of all the recommendations addressed to all states by UN bodies, the Universal Periodic Review, treaty bodies, special procedures, and it really gathers all the data. And this data can be searched by theme, by affected groups, groups left behind, SDGs, SDG targets. What's important as well is that this online database feeds into a number of databases worldwide, including the Danish Institute online database that I will shortly present, which is the SDG Human Rights Data Explorer, but also you may have heard about Simore, developed by Paraguay, Simore Plus, that has also been developed by Paraguay, that has a special emphasis on SDGs. All this is fed by this OHHR online database, and a new interface of the online database OHHR Universal Human Rights Index will be launched in the fall. Now, the other database which is linked to this one, and there's a very strong and close collaboration between OHHR and the Danish Institute, is the SDG Human Rights Data Explorer. Here, the focus is more on SDG entry, because you can really search and really explore the data by SDG target and make some deductions and really make analysis. Here you can see, for example, that there is an analysis of all the recommendations across the goals that touch upon specifically indigenous peoples. So in order to report to the VNR, this tool is very important, because the recommendations highlight root causes of inequalities, for example, issues that may be at stake, groups that may be left behind, and progress that needs to be made. And that's what can also feed for states, actually, but also for other stakeholders into the VNR processes at a more general level. Now, lastly, the National Recommendations Tracking Database, which is OHHR, that is developed by OHHR. This is directly related to the Universal Human Rights Index that I mentioned, but this is a state database. We have made available this database since 2018 to states who wish to acquire this database, and it enables a state, a specific state, to just get all the recommendations to its particular country and build implementation plans, define activities to implement specific recommendations, have activities, budgets, distributing also the they need to be implemented to specific ministries, for example. And since, of course, the recommendations are linked to SDGs, It also enables states to track the implementation of both human rights and SDGs, and therefore it can be a very useful tool. So just to show the last slide, you can see, for example, this is an imaginary state where you can see the division per SDG, and basically for all the recommendations, it's staggered by like the activities or the way the recommendations have been implemented, whether they have started to be implemented, they have been implemented or partially, and that's basically what you can draw from the National Recommendations Tracking Database. What's important is that this is, in a way, a shell that states acquire, and therefore it's not publicly available. We, of course, encourage states to, make those databases public, but they're not automatically made public. If you need more information, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie-Eve. It was great. That was a really good run through. Very exciting to hear of these tools and of the new ones coming out in the fall. I'd like to go, please, to the next part of this session, which is about practical application of these ideas at a country level. And we're very happy indeed to have 3 speakers from Kenya. We have Samson Omondi of the Kenya National Commission of Human Rights, who is a senior human rights officer at the Commission and who works actively on policy, legal and institutional reforms, focusing on access to justice, penal and social security. He will be followed by Robert Buluma, who is a manager in charge of governance, peace and security statistics, working with the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. He's worked with the Bureau for over 31 years and holds a BSc Maths and Bachelor of Philosophy in Economics and Masters in Arts degrees, and pursuing a PhD in Development Studies. We will then, the session will be completed by the words of George Awala, who is co-chair of the SDGs Kenya Forum. He's country director for VSO, has been involved in civil society reporting on VNR processes in Kenya, policy and advocacy on governance, education, women's empowerment and volunteerism, and is a writer on development on the platform. And I will now turn to Samson to kick us off for your 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I think it's important to note from the onset that the 2030 agenda is important to those of us that work in the human rights sector, because it's an agenda that focuses on those that are traditionally left behind, and that is the essence of human rights. I think at the Commission, SDG agenda is important, and therefore what the Commission did is we got into a collaborative partnership with the National Statistical Office in Kenya through a memorandum of understanding. The memorandum of understanding was signed in 2017, and it was born from the fact that we realized that the National Human Rights Institution and the National Statistical Office have different strengths, different challenges, and different things that needed to deal with in getting the right data that can be used for SDG reporting. The next slide, please. And therefore, the Commission signed a memorandum of understanding which built on 3 things. It built on strength, it built on opportunities, and it built on challenges that these institutions have. The memorandum of understanding focuses on data collection, data disaggregation, and data dissemination. And the focus on these 3 items is due to the fact that you'll find that the National Human Rights Institution have issues or matters that it has strengths on. And the National Statistical Office also has matters that it has strengths on. For example, The National Statistical Office in all countries focuses on ensuring that data that is collected, disaggregated, and disseminated follows a clear methodological approach, which in most cases is not available from national human rights institutions. So while the national human rights institution will focus on really what we call the rights-based approach to data collection, the national statistical offices would focus on ensuring that statistical methodologies are applied. So these strengths that are driven from two partners really led to the signing of this memorandum of understanding and ensuring that these institutions work closely and ensuring that we get the right data which is required for reporting and driving the human rights agenda for all the partners. Next slide, please. So what has this done for us as an institution? In terms of more reliable data, and this reliable data comes from the National Statistical Office, because the amount of expertise that they put in analyzing data, the expertise that they put in collecting data, the expertise that they put in disseminating data, the Commission is able to leverage on that, so that all our programming focuses on data which is reliable and can be used by the Commission in programming. Number two is that the impact, we have seen a lot of insights on focusing on groups that have been left behind. And what we've done at the Commission in collaboration with the National Statistical Office is we have localized the list of persons that have been left behind. And at the Commission, now working with the National Statistical Office and the National Human Rights Institution, we've developed a list of 20 groups of persons that have been left behind. So we have persons with persons living with disabilities, IDPs, refugees, asylum seekers, orphans and vulnerable children, victims of trafficking, child labor, the elderly, street children. Now the focus on having really this list that focuses on the local situation is that we are able to program according to our local needs. And now when the National Statistical Office is collecting data, then this data focuses on this aspect, which again is passed over to the National Commission on Human Rights to deal with on programming for the benefit of these groups that have been left behind. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, Samson, but I think your time's up for your 4 minutes. Do you have?
Okay.
Sorry,
so
it's just gone.
I'll pass over to Mr. Buluma, who will then pick up for me. Thank you, Sylvia.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much, Samson. So, okay.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, from wherever you are. As you have heard, my name is Robert Buluma. I want to talk about human rights and SDG reporting in Kenya with specific examples from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. As Samson mentioned, we signed a memorandum of understanding, and the main objective of that was to establish a collaboration relationship to strengthen cooperation on data collection, disaggregation, analysis, and dissemination. This assists in various ways by measuring progress of SDGs and ensuring that no one is left behind in the spirit of SDGs and international human rights. So how does the work and SDG reporting? KNGS has been able to produce the following data. Persons with disability in last census using Washington Group of persons with disability questionnaire. We have also been able to put in questions on refugees, asylum seekers, statelessness persons in the last census. We also did put in a question on intersex data in the last census. We also put in questions which will focus on indigenous groups and ethnic minorities, overseas, victims of trafficking, child labor, and the elderly in the last census. We also have we have also collected information in terms of FGM in the 2014 Kenya demographic a census of street families, whose report was released last month. Then we also have information on children in conflict with the law, which we published this year in the economic survey. So what are the key lessons? The key lessons learned from human rights to inform data collection and reporting for SDG 16 in the national context include data is available now to feed into the national SDG reporting, inform policy direction, provide and set a response plan, monitoring. Next slide, please. Monitoring and evaluation of programs and projects. For example, violence against children survey, which is being released this week. We did that survey in 2019, finished in January. So we are launching the report. So there is also an persons with disabilities, and then also the elderly and the overseas in Kenya. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely on time. So you're within time, actually. So can we now pass to George for his 4 minutes?
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are watching from. And thank you very much for connecting with us for this. I do represent the SDGs Kenya Forum, which is a platform of more than 300 civil society organizations that are working with the Kenyan government to ensure that we are able to track the SDGs, and we are also able to support the government in reporting in regards to the SDGs. The platform also really truly tries to capture the voices of the most marginalized people by projecting their voice during the reporting processes, but also generally through the voluntary national reporting mechanisms, and also when citizens are engaged with the government in terms of development. Our work has advanced both the human rights and the Agenda 2030 from the perspective of bringing together different groups as part of a multi-stakeholder platform, whereby we've been able to work with the government to monitor, track, and report on SDGs with a civil society lens, and ensuring that the voices of the very marginalized are brought to the fore. We've been organizing citizen dialogues for the last 4 years or so. And through these dialogues, we've been able to reach more than 1 million local citizens through physical meetings, and 5 million through vernacular radio stations, where the citizens can be able to express themselves. And we use these as platforms also to generate data that can now be used by the government of Kenya and other stakeholders to capture the voice and aspirations of the citizens. What has been the key lessons that we have learned from this process? I think critical is being able to really establish who's truly left behind. Sometimes it's very complex and challenging. Through this process, we've been able to identify that older persons are left behind, persons with disabilities are also left behind. We've also been able to see that widows and orphans and rural women and youth, especially those who drop out of school, are most left behind. So from this analysis, we are now able to really be able to capture their voices and aspirations. The other thing has been around realizing that recognizing citizen-generated data in national statistics takes time. The two presenters talked about the collaboration that's going on between the Human Rights Commission and also with the Bureau of Statistics. So as civil society players, we are also within that space trying to influence them to accept these alternative data sets. And we are very grateful that in the 2019 census, the Washington Group of Questions was used as a tool to collect disability prevalence and types. So it's a process, but we are making steady wins, and we are very happy because there is that openness to engage. It's also important to really recognize that promote rule of law and support development. And also, it's critical to strengthen institutions that are mandated to uphold human rights in Kenya. So that's why this platform is important, because it brings together like 300 civil society organizations, all having a variety and different interests, faith-based, disability, representing sectors like water, land. So it's really an interesting mix. And it's really also important because it enables us to strengthen the capacity of civil society and institutions that are promoting human rights, inclusivity, accountability, and also supporting matters around positive development. The citizens also need to exercise their right to information, because in Kenya, we find that there is opportunities for engagement with government through a variety of platforms at the local and the national level. But
George?
sometimes you find that citizens, this exercise has enabled us to really capture the aspirations and give citizens that opportunity to exercise the space and the right that's provided by these spaces. I think I'll stop there because of time.
Yeah, I'm really sorry, but actually you're out of time. It's too short, I know.
So those are the contacts there.
The contacts are there, everyone. So please take note, and they will all be uploaded on the website.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, George, Sampson, and Robert. In interests of time, we're going to go straight on to the next session. But please, everyone, will you hold your questions, because we're advised by Harris of UNITAR that if you can stay on for a little bit, we can take all the questions then. Don't go away. But I just to sort of pull a few thoughts together on that last one. I mean, we know from this that there are these very important tools that exist, and future VNRs can identify the human rights framework much more clearly with civil society contributions. And in Kenya, this alignment's already producing results, with policies changed and data collection happening and citizens feeling more involved. So all of that is really positive, and thank you very much, Marie-Eve, George, Robert, and Sampson for your contribution. So I'm now going to move to the third session, which is devoted to civil society tools and approaches to the SDG monitoring. Without civil society meaningful engagement, can the SDGs be successful? And so we're going to kick off hearing from Ollie Henman, who is the Global Coordinator of Action for Sustainable Development, Global Civil Society Network, more than 3,000 members around the world, primarily in the Global South. And Ollie is going to outline the experience of supporting national civil society reports and the People's Scorecard. He will share a presentation with John Romano, who's the coordinator of TAP, the Transparency, Accountability and Participation Network, which is a broad civil society network working on SDG 16 and accountability. And John will tell us about the network's accountability handbook and SDG spotlight reporting tools, and the campaign for a decade of accountability for the SDGs. They will share a presentation, and this will be followed by Annie Namala, who will talk to us about the work in India she is doing. She's working with vulnerable communities for the past 20 years and is the convener of Wada Na Todo Abhiyan, the National CSO Coalition of India. So I'm going to pass to Ollie, who I think has got a slideshow and which he will share with John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. It's great to join this call. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening again from me. It's fantastic to be part of this. And I think there's a really clear pattern emerging here through this joint session where we've heard from local level. We've also heard in particular about the importance of the human rights frameworks to understand the SDGs. And this picture would not be complete without having the civil society point of view. And it's great to follow on from George, who I know well and we've worked with over the years. I think Kenya is a great example where civil society is strongly mobilizing. So as Action for Sustainable Development, we provide some support and advice to those who are building national coalitions in different parts of the world. There are about 80 countries where there is some kind of a national coalition of civil society that responds to the official reporting and provides additional ideas and thoughts. And I think, as was highlighted earlier on by the ONS, can provide some additional qualitative views on how the implementation of the goals is actually happening on the ground in different countries. We support about 15 coalitions each year. Normally that is those who are perhaps in the global south that have a particular focus around bringing in diverse voices. We really emphasize the importance of leaving no one behind, the critical engagement of those from diverse age backgrounds, gender, balance, disability, geography. So ensuring that those voices are heard outside the capitals, that this is not just a discussion amongst those who are most able to engage, but that this really is a genuine dialogue that brings in as broad a range of views as possible. So in this year, for example, in 2020, we've been supporting a number of the coalitions in key countries that are doing VNRs, such as Burundi, Malawi, Zambia, Nigeria, Kenya, India, which we're going to hear from shortly, an extremely strong example, Bangladesh, Peru, Kyrgyzstan, and the list continues. But it's really powerful to understand this is a coalition, this is about mutual learning. No one has the answers, but really we're learning in the process together. I think what has been useful over the last 5 years is that through this process, we've actually identified ways of sharing the knowledge that exists within national coalitions. And this People's Scorecard emerged from the experience of countries like Kenya, like India, like Brazil, like Sri Lanka, where national civil society groups have been developing their own models, and we really wanted to share and exchange that experience. So the scorecard, for the first time, allows us to try to give some sort of comparison between countries. I'm not saying that it's perfect at this stage. This is still an emerging process that we're developing very much in partnership with different groups in different countries. But the idea here is that we start to be able to evaluate progress on each of the goals from a civil society point of view and compare between countries, because so often comparison. So I have a few emerging findings to share. So for example, on goal 1, which is around levels of poverty, you'll see here that the perspective from civil society is that, you know, this is clearly a big issue in many countries, Guatemala, Malawi, Zambia in particular, highlighting the challenges that they're facing. Other countries perhaps going further and coming out of that initial level of extreme poverty. Goal 5, in comparison, places like Mauritania saying that actually this is somewhere where they're making progress. Indonesia as well, interestingly, Kenya. So there are changes happening in different countries. Goal 10 on inequality, here you'll notice Guatemala struggling, but also Nigeria, which is a country that has wealth, significant wealth, and yet the inequality gap is growing. And so you can start to identify where the gaps are. And I can see Sylvia, so my final slide, which ties back to the human rights indicators, is of course goal 16. This is a major concern for many civil society groups, but again, you can see a diversity here and a diversity of views on how countries are progressing on goal 16 and whether or not they're responding to civil society demands. So there'll be more to say, and if you have time to join us, we have a session tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning in New York time, which is all about the whole of society approach to reporting. So please join that side event, and we'll have more details and some of our national partners as well. But I'll pass over to John Romano now from TAP.
Thank you very much, Ollie, and don't forget to join the session tomorrow. Okay, John, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, Sylvia. Thanks, Ollie. I think it's always great to speak after Ollie. Gives a great background about the value of engaging with civil society and the value of engaging with civil society spotlight reports or scorecards. I'll talk about that in just a second, but I think what we've learned from experience over the past few years is that this type of reporting comes in many different forms and structures and methodologies, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I just wanted to briefly introduce one of the resources that the TAP network has developed over the course of the past few years. This was a work in progress over a couple of years, launched last year. What we call the SDG Accountability Handbook. Basically, I mean, just for those of you that want to find out more information, I can't dive too deep into it right now, but you can find it. It's really simple, sdgaccountability.org. But basically, it's a resource guide for civil society, particularly working at the national and local level, to help understand approaches to holding governments accountable and the civil society spotlight reporting aspect. The accountability chain that really needs to be linked together to ensure that we're holding governments accountable for the SDGs. So it really provides some practical guidance and resources on how you can do that. Again, you can explore much more online at sdgaccountability.org. Next slide, please. So talking a little bit about spotlight reporting. So Ollie touched on this a little bit, and again, we could take a really deep dive and spend hours talking about this even. But we've also put together some guidance and resources around spotlight reporting, including guidelines. With again, this has been a work in progress over the past few years or so, taking stock of the reports that have been put together so far. Analyzing their methodologies and approaches, and then coming up with some guidance on how colleagues can start to coalesce around some common methodologies and approaches. And again, we've also done an analysis just recently on comparing SDG 16 spotlight reports with the VNRs over the past couple of years with GIZ. You can find a link to that report there. I think what we've just one brief reflection on all of that. I think as Ollie mentioned, these reports are often compiled by coalitions of civil society. So the excuse that we often hear from governments when they don't include civil society as well as we would hope is that it's difficult to do so, and it's a fair point. But I think the value of engaging with spotlight reports is that, again, these reports have been put together over many months by coalitions, national coalitions of civil society. It's a really efficient way for a government to consult with civil society and bring the views of civil society on board. We also found that spotlight reports were not just naming and shaming or finger pointing. I mean, they provided recommendations for the government to concretely take up. And I think that's, if we're looking for a really productive VNR process, we want to know how citizens are perceiving progress and how they're feeling progress and what they feel that their government should be providing beyond what they're already progressing on. So there's just a couple of reflections, but there's a lot more in those reports, which you can find here and linked here. So next slide, please. So finally, just wanted to briefly mention a campaign that we've launched with a number of other partners, again, around SDG accountability, advancing SDG accountability over this next decade. Complementary to the Decade of Action that member states committed to last year at the SDGs Summit. This is a campaign, a broad multi-stakeholder campaign where we'll feature a global SDG account. The inputs into this report are, you can see a global SDG accountability survey. You can find links in 4 different languages there. We would love to have your inputs. This is really to help us put a finger on the pulse of how SDG accountability is and how we can improve it. And of course, we'll have a side event on Thursday morning. You can find more information on our website and linked here. We'll talk a lot more about the campaign and about the ways to engage in that campaign. So we'd obviously love to have you at that event as well. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more, but I'll stop there.
Sorry, I got myself on the wrong thing. Start video.
Sylvia, if you could.
Sylvia.
Sorry, am I unmuted? Thank you, John, for that. There's so much more to say, and lots to come out in further discussion. But I think in the Annie, and hopefully we will have a bit of time at the end for discussion and questions. So can I move to Annie? The floor is yours, Annie. You've got about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And as everybody else, a good day to every one of you, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. As Sylvia mentioned and Oli mentioned, I represent the Vadana Todo Abhiyan. We short call it WNTA, and it means Do Not Break Your Promises. It is a civil society campaign, a platform with about 3,000 members across India. Primarily, our purpose is to promote accountability to end social exclusion and poverty. And in keeping with that objective, 2 things that the campaign does is, 1, to have an annual report of look at the progress of the SDG implementation. It is with the SDGs that we really thought of the need to center stage the leave no one behind principle in India. And as you would sort of look at, I think like everywhere else and more so in India, about 40% of our population do really come from vulnerable communities. And there is a variety and diversity of vulnerable communities. Like in India, if you see, there are about 3,000 caste groups, 700 plus tribal groups, then you have religious groups, then you have every other kind of, diversity and inequality, whether it is disability, gender, sexual orientation, nomadic community. So we are really a country with diverse communities and huge inequalities. And the core agenda for us to start this whole process was that communities, except for our census, which happens once in 10 years, every other is a sample survey, and these communities do not figure at all in any of this data. So while we talk of averages, there is huge variations, and that's when we realize that the leave no one principle becomes very important. So I think disaggregated data, there is no doubt that disaggregated data is very critical if we are talking of the SDGs. But along with that, what we also realized is community generated data is important. It's not just taking the data and making it available, but actually empowering communities to collect data, to analyze data, to use it for their own advocacy. And that's when we said our focus will be the geo-social community in a particular area. We would identify small communities which are the most vulnerable, the most invisible, left out. Take a sample of households, a minimum of 100 households, to collect data. In the process, we also evolved a technology platform that can gather this data, store this data, and be available for any kind of analysis. So I think the whole thing to say that it was really a process of engaging the vulnerable communities in being able to look at the data and use it for their own advocacy purposes. I just want to sort of bring two small examples. If we just look at the education and health, India, the national average literacy rate is 74%. But if you look at, we did this with about 15 communities, and if you look at that, there is anywhere from 20 to 40% of literacy among these communities. So that is the kind of a gap that you have between these and the national averages. Similarly, about 40% of our children go to private schools, but in this, almost 100% goes to private schools. And if you, when all of them are entitled for services of scholarship, only about 10% get the scholarship in many of these communities. Similarly, if you look at the health, on an average, the out-of-pocket expenditure is about 21,000 Indian rupees, but you have some communities that spend more than that, and that is primarily because of the illness burden they have, plus occupational hazards and violence. And you have some that spend much less, and that's not because they're not ill, but because they have a lack of access and they have a lack of health-seeking behaviors, ability to spend money on it. So I would sort of say that when we are looking at these data across communities, we see this huge inequalities and the gaps that we sort of come across. In this whole process, for us, this is a very new initiative in the sense that we started this about almost 2 years ago, and we have been able to cover 35 communities who've never been highlighted before. And this include LGBT communities, some of the very vulnerable tribal communities, single women, sex workers. So it's been like something what I heard in Kenya, trying to look at the most left out communities. We've got about 100 champions who have been trained from these communities, are able to use the data platform, gather their data. And I think we've more or less been able to work on this technological intervention, which we can then use for further getting data. And so I think in some way we've been able to initiate a system that provides a tool and a methodology for these communities. But of course, the challenge is engagement with the government, being able to align this data with government data, fill up the gaps, and make it more robust. We're just the beginning part of it. But I would just like to say that with this kind of an initiative, we've been able to engage very actively with the VNR process, particularly to look at vulnerable communities. And right now we are involved with the UN agencies to look at the socioeconomic impact of COVID and vulnerable communities. So I hope that we would be able to go more and more towards strengthening community generated data and use it for communities development and advocacy issues. I just want to say that in this whole process, we've had communities that have come up and said, this is the first time anybody has come and asked us anything about our communities. We've had the activists and the champions to say that this is a tool that we can use further. So I think diverse people have found diverse use of using this, and that I mean, if we are able to cover the different communities and use it forward, that would be something principle of the SDGs. Thank you. I see Sylvia on the screen. Hi. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Sylvia, kindly unmute.
I'm trying to unmute. Okay, am I unmuted? Am I unmuted? Yeah. Thank you, Annie. That was really great because we've got a practical way forward in what you described. Because the real sort of crisis is that most of us who need to have these SDGs realized and our human rights realized are out of the picture. So what you're saying is of real significance. We've got, thank you very much. I mean, as we've heard, we've got and use and learn from and exchange. We've got a few minutes for questions. And I will also ask all panelists to give one takeaway to the participants at the end. I think we've got till, about another 10 minutes, and we didn't take questions after the last session. So I want to go back to questions which have come up from the session 2. I think there's a question specifically to Marie-Eve about the concrete steps necessary to realize human rights and SDGs at national level. You might want to respond to this and also come in with your Kenyan colleague.
Sylvia, maybe, so the question to OHHR, which was a very big question, was what concrete steps are necessary to realize human rights and SDGs at the national level. So I would say that there are 4 main ways. Exploit the tracking tools to measure progress on SDGs and human rights obligations, and I think we've shared quite a few. And if they were used, I think this would really enable it would enable to track the implementation at the national level. The other thing is to improve the coordination among governmental structures at the national level to adopt comprehensive policies that show the connection between the goals and between all human rights issues. And actually on that, OHHR promotes the coordination between ministries in charge of human rights and those in charge of working towards achieving the 2030 agenda. The third aspect is using disaggregated data to identify those who may be left behind and adopt corrective measures. And the fourth aspect is increase meaningful participation. And maybe my takeaways would be, again, the importance to better align human rights and SDG reporting, follow-up and implementation processes, and really to ensure actually accountability and to ensure that no one is left behind, and also the centrality of SDG 16 as a key enabler. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Very clear, and thank you for giving us your takeaway. We have a couple of questions from the previous session for Kenya. So the first one, please, for Kenya is it's a big question, and what is the key takeaway from your experience that you think others can learn from? And we have a couple of quite specific questions. If you can share or know the latest data on FGM in Kenya. And thirdly, is it possible to share the MOU between the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights? So I'll request one of the colleagues from Kenya to take it away. Who will reply to that? Those questions. Okay, Samson.
Great, thank you. What is the takeaway for other colleagues? I think in MOU development process, I think I would want colleagues from other countries and other institutions to understand that it's a very painstaking and painful process, especially between two government agencies, considering that national human rights institutions in most countries are considered to be, for lack of a better term, institutions that are loggerheads with government. Therefore, one of the things that any organization must learn if it wants to sign an MOU with their National Statistical Office is that they must be very clear to the National Statistical Office what will they get from it. I think that is important. What does that MOU mean for the National Statistical Office itself? And for the Kenyan experience, our selling point was when we are reporting at the international level, there's data that is always lacking, but this data is available. It is only that the National Statistical Office is not able to get it because of the methodologies that they use. And therefore, using that path, we were able to get into this process of explaining the importance of signing this MOU so that the National Statistical Office is able to get data that traditionally they have not used. I think that is one. Number two takeaway, I think, for other organizations is that it's important that there is clarity of purpose. And the clarity of purpose comes in terms of what do you aim to get from this? I think for the Commission, our clarity for purpose was that we wanted a rights-based approach to data collection. And for the National Statistical Office is that they wanted support in terms of getting data which they cannot have. So that clarity of purpose, I think, is really important. In its absence, an MOU would not work. I think finally, from me, is on the MOU. I think the MOU can be shared. It's for the Commission is a public document, and because we use it for learning purposes, to share and what not to share. I think I will leave the other question on FGM to my other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Samson. So over to you, George.
Yeah, so in regards to the FGM, maybe there are about 4 million girls who have undergone FGM in Kenya. About 21% of girls and women aged between 15 and 49 could have been subject to this practice. But I think one of the things that's happening is that there is very good progress that's being made. So Kenya has really made good progress over the last 3 decades. And so the practice has been banned by law. So it's not something that people can practice in the open. A lot of it is now underground. And that's why civil society organizations and government units and departments that are focusing on gender are responding. So in terms of the key takeaways, I think linked to what Samson has said, I think it's really important to collaborate, especially the government, media, private sector, the academia and civil society, because if we can empower citizens so that they exercise their right to access information, they can use that information to be able to hold government to account, and they can also use it in multiple platforms to create more awareness within the community, but also generate interest around some of those issues. And if you can do more of the dialogues with the communities, then you are now creating more interest on the SDGs and really enabling them to appreciate and really value why citizen-generated data is important, because it's used for multiple purposes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Robert, do you want to complete this round?
Yes, I want just to add the key takeaway.
Okay.
When the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights came to us to sign an MOU, already the Bureau had been working on governance, peace and security statistics for over 17 years. We started doing this in the year 2001. So collecting data on governance, peace and security or justice data in Kenya has never been a problem, because we are supported by the government to do that. So, and in most cases, you'll find in many countries, they would even wonder how you can go to a police station and even collect data information on crime and all this. So the beginning point for national statistical offices is to set up statistical units that can be able to collect data on governance, peace and security statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question which is related to this, and it's probably for Marie-Eve as well as yourselves, about police brutality and where that falls in SDG monitoring in light of what you've just said, Robert, and how many indicators of SDG 16 might be available for Kenya, whether they are aligned with UN metadata. I don't know the best person to answer those questions. Is it you, Marie-Eve? Is it you, Robert?
I can answer that.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of the number of indicators that we report in for SDGs in Kenya, we have a total of 128 indicators. and they are all aligned to metadata, SDG metadata. Now, in terms of police brutality,
I think we've momentarily lost Robert.
Hey, Robert's, he's frozen. Mute. Can you ask him, should we move on or?
I think we should move on.
Okay, fine. I'm sorry, Robert, we've lost you. Maybe you can hear us. So I mean, we're completely out of time, but UNITA have been very generous and have given us another 5 minutes. So I would like to ask any of the panelists for a key takeaway that they want to share with the participants. And I will start with Annie, please, because you've popped up there. The others. Thank you.
One of the takeaways that we have from India is a country that has recognized disadvantaged communities even at the time of our independence. But what we realize is within this broader communities, there are multiple smaller communities. I mean, very recently we had a consultation on the aged, and we were shocked to see the number of intersectional groups, aged who live on their own, aged who are poor, aged who are dependent. I mean, like you have multiple intersectionalities in any vulnerable group. And I think we need to reach down to that intersectional groups to really make SDG work for everybody. And that is a big takeaway, that every country, every society, even when we look at broad vulnerabilities, we do have a lot of inner vulnerabilities that we need to look at. Need a lot more of engagement from the government to take civil society and other data that is available, because there is a lot of data and we can do so much better by collaborating together. That needs a global civil society campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is really important. The partnerships coming together, collaboration, and that we can do it. The tools are there if the will is there and the political will is there. I'm going to ask Ollie if he would like to say anything, please.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And I was partly responding to one of the comments I see in the chat about whether CSOs remain independent and are able to carry on challenging government. And I think it's really essential that we have an open and a mutual dialogue that actually allows voices to be heard. And I think the importance of freedom of information, the importance of human rights underpinning the whole agenda is really essential here. There is something else I wanted to add, which is the impact of COVID, and various people have touched on it. The pandemic has changed the balance of dialogue. So much of our dialogue now happens like this, online. And I think there is some work to be done around how we improve the online spaces to ensure that we open the digital doors so that people can also participate. And potentially, this might actually mean more voices can be heard, because actually you don't necessarily need to fly to a meeting in New York, so you can actually hear more diverse voices at meetings like this. And I think we need to really go further along that to really bring out as many different voices as we can.
Thank you very much, Ollie. I think the challenge there will be the digital inclusion of the groups described so Annie and by our colleagues from Kenya. But I mean, of course, that is what we have to do. Can I ask if there's any other takeaway, perhaps from Fiona or Dawn and Angela or John? Who wants to speak? Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to speak. Is that okay, Angela? Sylvia, sorry. So from our group, I think the big takeaway is the need for partnerships and the need to think beyond sort of, definitely in my case, just official statistics, and think about all the richness of data there is, qualitative, civil society data. And we've heard so much this evening about the different types and sources of data. And I think working in partnership, for us in the UK, it's working more with the local authorities and the cities such as Bristol to understand how we can support and how we can do, not only at the regional level, but across the leave no one behind characteristics.
I'm muted. Thank you very much, Fiona. Okay, does anyone else want to say anything on this rich panel? I see George.
Yeah, I think just building up on Fiona's point around partnerships, it is really crucial to strengthen institutions, whether it's government institutions or citizen institutions, promote inclusivity, and also champion accountability. Because if we do this, then we can now be able to even utilize the rich data that could be coming from the government side or citizen generated to really inform and enable enhanced service delivery. So I think it's critical that, yes, capacity building, strengthening institutions is something that we really believe in and work through, because that in itself can improve things a lot more quicker.
Thank you very much, George. I'm going to turn quickly to John, who may have the last. I may say a couple of things, but at the end, but to wrap up.
Yeah,
John, over to you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, I mean, this has been a great overview of some of the really great case studies of the great things that are happening on a positive level and things that we can replicate going forward. But I do think that one particular challenge for us going forward, and something to think much further about in follow-up from this, is how do we reach countries and groups that are often where the situation isn't conducive to apply some of these methodologies or approaches, like countries where civic space is shrinking or non-existent, for example. So how do we, I think that's the big challenge, is reaching the countries that are furthest behind, and the countries where the space isn't as simple or easy politically to operate in. It's a big challenge collectively.
Thank you, John. It's good to end with a challenge. I guess my response to that would be we have these wonderful examples of community activism, and let's not forget how people can actually change things from the bottom up, but it's a long haul. So this panel has been excellent in both showing us what's actually out there in terms of tools that can be used, but the challenges of going right down to the bottom and reaching people who are very marginalized from policy and voice. National human rights bodies at a national level are collaborating with government, and ways that is happening. But no one's going to say it's easy, especially in the time of COVID. How long, we will have to deal with this, we're not sure. So I want to just wrap up then by saying what a great session. And I hope very much that those of you who are still on the call and who took notice of all the presentations will stay in touch and will tune in to the sessions coming up this week and beyond. And for human rights and development to come together will be the game changer for the SDGs. Thank you very much, everyone. And I think we will have to sign off with a few thanks for the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, with the Kenyan partners, with TAP, with the UK government, with Annie. If anyone can take a screenshot, I don't know how you do that with LA, with Unitar. I can't do that sort of thing, but
just done it.
Oh, you've done it. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And
on behalf of everyone, we'd like to thank Sylvia for being our fearless leader over the course of the last 2 hours.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Quite a challenge, but a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, guys. Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.